Thank you, Steve. You're in good form this morning. Appreciate you. Good morning, church. Okay. Is that an indication of the sermon this morning? Mm-hmm. We're good. Good to see you, though. We're glad that you're here. Glad to have those that are listening by way of telephone as well. We appreciate you and appreciate those with us this morning. It's good to get together and to worship God. I did find out something Friday night, though, and I appreciate the mask. I wear my mask. Suzanne and I were out Friday night, and we were shopping, getting groceries, and one of my allergy sneezes snuck up on me. Do not sneeze in a mask. Whew. I found that out Friday night. Of course, I know you say, well, you've been doing this for a while. I understand, but I didn't catch that one, and the mask did. That's just nasty. But anyway, TMI. There was okay, Jay, I believe it's frozen this morning. Yeah. Oh, well. All right. Huh? Yeah, shake it a little bit. Leave the computers froze this morning. We've been studying, before we get to the first part, we've been studying out of Galatians chapter 5, the fruit of the Spirit. This is the last in that series. You may want to celebrate, I don't know. But Paul talks about love, joy, peace, long-suffering. Thank you, Jay. Could have met you there. Should have. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, forgiveness. Now we get to self-control. Self-control is not an easy aspect. But yet, Paul said in Galatians chapter 5, if we're going to live in the Spirit, we need to walk by the Spirit. In other words, if we're going to say we're Christians, we need to do what God says to do. And here's how we do that. And we've been talking about these 9 qualities. There was a preacher one time. His wife was coming up on a special birthday, and so he wanted to give her a special gift. And so he decided what he would do. And he went out to a local airport, and there was a stunt pilot out there who had a stunt plane. And he wanted to give his wife a ride in a stunt airplane. And so he asked the man, he said, well, how much will that be? And the pilot told him how much it would cost. And he said, man, that's a lot of money. I don't know that I want to give that for her present, but I certainly want her to have this experience. That's a lot of money. And so the stunt pilot said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, instead of making it that price, he said, we'll cut it in half, and that's how much I charge for one person. He says, but now here's the deal. He says, both of you in the plane, he says, we'll take you through all of the stunts, and he says, but if there's a sound, any one sound that's made during the flight, I'm going to double the price. We're going to go back up the price for 2. But if no sound's made, I'll just charge you for the 1. How about that? Preacher said, great idea. Like that. Not a preacher in this world who doesn't like a bargain. And so he said, yeah, I like that. I like that idea a lot. And so came the day for her and her husband to get into the stunt plane. They went out to the airport. They got in the plane. They took off. And boy, the stunt pilot was carrying them through all the paces. Turning left, turning right, going straight up, going straight down. Everything he did, not a sound, not a sound. They landed the plane, and the stunt pilot said, man, I just can't believe it. He said, I tried everything. I thought surely we'd get a sound out of you. And the preacher said, well, you almost did when my wife fell out back some time ago. But he said, I held it in. The ability to control oneself is not an easy task. To have that calmness of spirit, that calmness of heart. Because we know that Satan is going to get after us, right? We know that Satan is pugnacious. We know that he is the master tempter. We know that he is relentless. We know that we are those that he's after. And yet, the Bible talks about better is he that controls his spirit than he that takes a city. Proverbs chapter 16, the last part of verse 32. God loves and expects self-control. And yet out of all of these, we might say this might be the hardest. I don't know. Gentleness and goodness sometimes just seem to go against our nature sometimes. Yet at the same time, too, self-control. Self-control is difficult, but it's difficult because of what it is. Well, what is it? What do we mean when we use the word self-control? It's the ability, by definition, it's the ability to control one's feelings and overcome one's weaknesses. Easy, right? Not hardly. It's also been defined as the idea of taking hold of. Taking hold of what? Well, you see, that's where, to me, that definition is incomplete. But it's the idea of taking hold of oneself so as to not let go of oneself. The Greek itself, the word that Paul uses in Galatians 5, means to have dominion from within. And so what are you having dominion of? Your dominion of self. We know that all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And yet that is a constant pull that we have. And so we have to have that dominion of self, that power over our natural impulses and our instincts, and sometimes those things that we just think need to be done, but we know that as Christians they shouldn't be. And so we have to have that power over self. Paul wrote in Romans, the 6th chapter, in verse 12, he says, "Let not sin have dominion over you." And then he talks about, in the very next verse, that we are to yield ourselves, we are to give ourselves as instruments of God to righteousness. Now, if sin's not to reign over our body, but we are to give ourselves to righteousness, then we need to have dominion over self. Why? Because Satan sometimes puts those little thoughts in our heads, doesn't he, if you will? Through his tools and his tricks and his teachers that he uses to tempt us. Our natural inclination sometimes is to speak when we need to be silent. It's to do when we really need to sit. It's to act when we need to pause. And so many times we need to simply put, just stop and think. As you know, for about 11 months, for almost a year, I worked in industry before I came here. And one of the great lessons that I learned from a young man who was not my supervisor, but my manager, was that when something didn't go right with the machine, he would say, "Paul," when I first started, because I was one of these, we got to fix it, we got to get it, we got to keep going. He would say, "Stop and let the machine tell you what's wrong with itself. Let the machine tell you what's wrong, so then you can go and take care of what needs to be taken care of." And so many times we need to do that. We need to stop, we need to look, we need to listen. Well, what is that? That's part of self-control, having dominion over self. Taking hold of oneself, controlling one's passions, and overcoming one's weaknesses, so that ultimately we become what? Balanced people. You might say, well, why is balance so important? Well, I've never preached that here yet. I will. But it's the idea, if you stop and think about it, God is balanced, goodness and severity. The Bible is balanced. It's profitable for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. Tells us that we need to be balanced. So God balanced, Bible balanced, Christians are to be balanced, following Him in everything that He's told us to do. How do we manage that? Well, let's talk about areas of self-control. We understand what we need to control. I believe we come a longer ways in being able to be able to control those things that God wants us to be over. Let us understand that one of the great attacks of Satan is the body. It's the eyes. It's the ears. It's the feet. It's the hands. Right? It's the pull of the eyes. Let me see more of things that I don't need to see. All the time we talk about, from the standpoint of news, we look at news and look at headlines, and you can pull up on the computer, and there's always a headline there, and you think, I want to see that, and then you realize, no, I don't need to see that. Because that's something my eyes don't need to see as a Christian. And yes, we've come a long ways from Gone with the Wind, in which it had one word in it, and it was considered major catastrophe. To now, you don't get past the first 5 minutes without hearing several. And less long being in the movies, it's on TVs, and you realize, and we've become almost dull in ears. But then sometimes our feet takes us places that as Christians we don't need to be. Places that we don't need to go, activities that we don't need to participate in. And so we have to have control of self to say no. But not only do we stop and think about the body, and remember, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27, that he disciplined his body and brought it in subjection, lest that by any means, after I have preached the gospel, I myself should be a castaway. And we like that verse, and we remember that verse, and that's probably one of those that you memorized in Bible school years ago. But do you remember the context? Paul's talking about running a race. And he's talking about how that runners are temperate in all things. The word temperate there is the idea of self-control. They're in control of all things. And so while Paul says they run, they are temperate, they are self-controlled in all things, that they might win or what? A prize. A prize that perishes, though. Paul says we're going for one that does not. We're going for heaven. And so Paul says that I bring my body in subjection. I discipline my body so that I myself am not going and doing the things with my body that I'm preaching against. But then there's also the mind. The mind is something we need to control. Why? Because as a man thinks in his heart, what Solomon says, so is he. It's thoughts where things began, isn't it? It's thoughts where our emotions began. It's thoughts where our attitudes start. It's our thoughts. And so many times, if we rewire our thought process, then we can gain better control, right? If I think the right things, whatsoever things are true, honest, just, lovely, pure, and good report. Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, think on these things. That's why Paul would write in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, casting away every thought and everything. But he says, what did he do? He says, the last part of that verse, bringing every thought into captivity to Jesus Christ. Paul says, I want the Lord to be the Lord of my thoughts. I don't want him just to be the Lord of my body. I want him to be the Lord of my thoughts so that my attitudes are right, so that the things that I'm thinking are right. So my emotions are right. And so Paul says we need to learn to control our mind, but then we need to learn to control our tongue. James was right. The tongue is an unruly evil, and it's full of deadly poison, but who can tame it? Well, the wise man can tame it. James tells us the man that is able to control himself, the man that understands the power of the tongue. Tongue's used for a lot of things, isn't it? It can be used for good. It can be used to tell the truth. It can be used to encourage people, as we talked about Wednesday night in our Bible class. It can be used to help people. It can be used to assist others. It can be used in work to get the things done that need to be done. It can also be used for evil. It can be used for gossip. It can be used for lying, and it can be used for criticism. And so oftentimes that's where the devil hits us, right? We offer criticism without thinking. We offer gossip before we've really thought, oh, could that be true? and we tell a story just because it sounds better. But we need to learn to control our tongue. Not easy, but expected. Well, preacher, let's look at self-control. How hard is it? Genesis 39, there's a young man by the name of Joseph. You've heard the story. Joseph was sold by his brothers to the Ishmaelites, who then sold him, if you will, to Potiphar, an individual that was up in Pharaoh's cabinet, would probably be the best way of saying it. Remember now, his brothers didn't like him. Why? Because he was a favored son. His father had gotten him a coat and given him a coat of many colors, and his brothers didn't like it. And so, to make the long story short, they basically came up with a ploy one time, or a plan, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites, who then, as we said, got him to Potiphar's house. But yet, Genesis 39, it says that he had done quite well. He was a good man, he being Joseph, was a good man, and he had done quite well, and he was quite a success. Matter of fact, the best we can tell, he's the head, if you will, the head servant in Potiphar's household. Potiphar's wife decides that she wants to be with Joseph. Now, we often hear that story and we think, well, she came one time, she offered herself to him, and he said no. But go back and read the text. She is a relentless lady. She continues to offer herself to him, and he wants nothing to do with her. Why? He says, look, I can't do this to my God. He says, my master, he has held nothing back from me. I can't do anything. I can't do it against him. I can't do it against my God. I can't do this. And she keeps coming, and she keeps coming. And finally, one day, she catches him, and there's nobody home but her and him. He is not willing. I can't do this against my God. And so he runs out. And when he runs out, he leaves his coat behind. And she comes up. And she has a plan. To make the long story short for us today, she has a plan. He's basically thrown into prison, and the rest of his story is there to be read in Genesis 40 following. But there's a man that had self-control. But preacher, we're talking about the whole body. You just listed, the mind and the body and the tongue. You listed everything that we need to have self-control over, and the answer is yes. But there's a great example as we've been trying to visualize exactly what we are to control. Here's a man that had the strong fortitude to say no to Satan. Here's the man that was able to tell Satan, no, I don't want a part of that. I don't want to do that. I want to do what God says do. Now we look back and think, okay, if I need to have control over my mind, and I need to have control over my body, and I need to have control over my mouth, and those are things, why? Because God has said, here's how you live your life. We ultimately ask ourselves, how do we do that? How do we develop that self-control? Well, I'm glad you asked. Now, let me share with you what I believe are some keys that help us in understanding how we need to learn to develop and how we can develop self-control. First of all, enthrone Jesus as the Lord of your life. Let Jesus change you. Did you hear the song that we sang right before the Lord's Supper that Steve led so beautifully this morning that you sang? Brother Alton Howard wrote that beautiful song, I believe. Did you catch that line, the second line there, the second stanza, where he says that he made a difference in me? When you sang that, did you really mean it? I believe you did. You wouldn't be here this morning. The idea of him making a difference in me is because of what he's done and who he is in my life. When he is the master of my life, when He is the one in charge of my life, when I give myself over to Him, when I enthrone Him as the Lord of my life. Now, don't miss out on the words of this step. Enthrone, the idea of placing first. Isn't that what Paul said? Set your affections on things above, not on things of the earth. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1. And then he tells us how to do that. And he tells us in verse 3 that we're to put the Lord first. Yeah. To enthrone is the idea of Jesus is first in my life. Jesus is more important than anybody else. You can tell my wife loves our granddaughter, right? Now you, as one of our members asked, what about you? Well, I said, she's not showing pictures of me. But she loves Graceland. She loves me too. But she loves Graceland. You have your grandchildren you love. Show her your pictures, she'll quit. I doubt it, because we love children. But to make Jesus the King of our life. And you see, notice the next word, Lord. Lord is the idea of master, the one that's in control. Make Jesus the master of your life. Set Him above. Make Him number one in your life. I like what Jesus said about Himself in John 8 and verse 29. I do all things which the Father has commanded me. In other words, there's not anything that the Lord has told me to do that I don't do. When we think about what Paul reminds us in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, where Paul talked about himself, he said, I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. In life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. Paul said, I died to self. Preacher, I don't want to die to self. I understand that. You might say, well, that's just against my nature. Yes, but remember who made you. It's God. Remember what your purpose is, to glorify God. Remember where you're headed, to heaven itself. Remember who gave you what you have. And then ask yourself, well, how can I do anything else but what the Lord wants me to do? How can I do and be anything else other than what the Lord wants me to be? If by Him all things consist, or all things exist and be, Colossians chapter 1, verse 17, then I need to be like Jesus. I need to do all things that my Lord commands me to do. I need to be reminded that I need to put self behind Jesus. The story is told back many years ago of a man that was holding meetings. And a lot of preachers did this. They would hold meetings in the summer. They would have a located place where they would preach at home during the winter months. And during the summer months, they would go do gospel meetings in various places. And he was up north. And he came across a lady that was a servant. She was at the well, the local well, drawing water. And as she was drawing water, the preacher asked her, said, would you give me a drink? And she said, after I serve my master. There's a great thought for us. When we enthrone Jesus over our life, our wants, our wishes, our thoughts, our thinking come second. For it's only after we have served our master. But then secondly, in order to have self-control, you got to work at it. Man, you got to work at it. Why? Because it's the slips. It's the slips that create the problems, right? And so we have to be at work, working at it, seeing what we can do. seeing how we can grow. You know, Paul did talk about keeping his body in subjection, disciplining his body, depending upon the version that you're using there in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. But you see, it's not just a one-time thing. Imagine someone wanting to go to the Olympics in whatever sport it is, whether it's the Summer Olympics and it's running, it's track and field or something along that nature, or it's a winter sport such as skiing or whatever. Imagine them saying, as they skied down the hill one time, well, I mastered that. I think I'll go to the Olympics. Oh, no. These folks train day in and day out, constantly training to get better, to improve, so that they can get that fine line, so that they can win. They're constantly working at it. Here, folks, you're going to slip up. That's all right. You're going to have relapses. You know, you've heard of those that have certain addictions, whether it's alcohol or it's pornography or it's drugs or whatever it may be, and they'll talk about how that they've had relapses. Okay, you're going to have those. It's not that you have the relapses, it's what you do when you have the relapse. What do? Do you get back up and say, well, I tried that once, that self-discipline thing, that just didn't work. I tried that self-control like God wanted me to. I just couldn't control myself. I couldn't control my tongue. I couldn't control my temper. I couldn't control my attitude. Couldn't control my emotions. I couldn't control anything. I give up. No. You're constantly working at it to get better. Why? Because in that word, the Bible, you're reminded, and I am reminded, that we as Christians are to grow. We're to desire the sincere milk of the word that we may grow, according to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 1 and 2. Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 3, grow in grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Hebrews chapter 5 tells us to grow. We're constantly growing. Well, how do you grow? You work at it. You don't walk into the gym the first day and all of a sudden you can run on the treadmill for an hour. You can lift the heaviest weights they've got. You start off slow. Work at it. Thirdly, you practice it. Practice self-discipline. Practice saying no to yourself. Little boy came in one day, he was crying, and his mother said, what in the world's wrong, honey? What has happened? And he looked up at his mom and he said, my daddy said a terrible word. What did your daddy say to you? He said, no. Yeah, we kind of live in that kind of society today, don't we? And that's the idea of self-discipline. Paul said what? Paul said in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, that we're to deny ourselves. Tell ourselves no. That's not fun. It's not easy. Hey, that's like going in a candy store and walking out without any, right? Who wants to do that? Of course, the best thing is don't go to the candy store. Well, who's not going to go to the candy store? The individual that's on a diet that has self-control. The individual that's not going to walk in, going to buy candy. My wife walked in yesterday evening. She said, after supper, I'm going to go to Sonic and get me a pretzel. It's the last day for pretzels. I said, fine. She said, I'll get you something as well. She gets ready to leave after supper. She says, I'm going to go get me a pretzel. I'm studying. I said, fine. What do you want? I want a milkshake. That's great, considering I've got to lose a few pounds. But I had that milkshake. But the scales told off on me this morning. You got to practice self-discipline. Saying no to self. I should have said, you have your pretzel. That's fine. I don't want anything. Because you see, when she came back with the milkshake, just a few minutes earlier, I'd had part of a candy bar. She didn't know that. She will when she finds the other half. But we need to practice it. Saying no to self. And then last, be patient. Be patient. But in that patience, be persistent. Be persistent. In your patience, in saying, okay, I got to wait, I got to move on, understand that you don't give up. You know, we like Philippians chapter 3, verse 13 and 14. Forgetting those things which are behind, I push towards the mark of the calling of God in Christ Jesus, right? We like verse 14. Oh, love it. Did you read verse 12 lately? Not that I'd already attained. I'm not there, nor am perfect. But then he says in the last part of verse 12, he says, basically, I'm trying to attain that which Jesus has attained for me. And so he says, then verse 13, forgetting those things which are behind, moving on. We as individuals need to understand that we need to be patient with ourselves. We're not going to be perfect. I think we have to remember something. We are not perfect. God understands we're not perfect. But isn't it wonderful that God has provided His grace to fill in for those times in which we are not perfect? I'm thankful for His grace. I'm thankful for His mercy. Because He understands. Paul Daugherty is not perfect. Paul Daugherty makes mistakes. Paul Daugherty lapses. Paul Daugherty tries, but sometimes he fails. And you can put your name in for Paul Daugherty and you can say the same thing. While God has called us to a standard, He says, you keep pushing for it. Don't ever give up. Keep trying the best you can to make it. Walter Payton was running back for the Chicago Bears. Back a few years ago, I saw an interesting statistic. It said that in his career, he ran a total yardage of 9 miles. But his average per run or per carry was 4.6 yards. So that means that every 4.6 yards, Walter Payton got knocked down, had to get back up in order so that through his career he could run 9 miles. Dear folks, get to heaven. We're going to run a little ways and we're going to get knocked down. Self-control is not going to be easy, but just be patient. Just hang on. We're going to get there. Because God has promised that on the day of judgment, we're going to give an account. And as we give an account of ourselves, we control ourselves with that idea of knowing that there is that which is yet to be, but which can be for us. God's not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. And so when we sit there and think, I can't, Paul says, oh, yes, you can. Looking forward to that day when He comes again. As we close the thoughts of the ideas of the fruit of the Spirit, we're reminded that our one goal is to get to heaven. Are you headed in that direction? Are you doing the best that you can? Do you need to become a child of God? Do you need to rededicate your life? Whatever the case may be, if you need to come, I want you to do so. All together we stand and sing.